This is sometimes, I think, a mistake that people think about libertarians, is that because I think all drugs should be legal, I think it's fine to do drugs, they're perfectly good for you. And that's not my opinion. Many drugs can be bad for you. Many lifestyle choices, many diet choices can be bad for you. And I'm perfectly happy for people like yourselves with expertise in that area to have an opinion and say, hey, I don't think you should be using fentanyl recreationally, right? This is a powerful drug. You should stay away from it. And I think that is probably a good and sound opinion. My problem is that when we then start to make this a matter of law and try to use the force of the state, and again, for you to say to someone, I don't think you should take fentanyl is one thing. For you to say, I've got men with guns outside, and if you continue to take fentanyl, they're going to put you in jail for life. I think that's completely wrong.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
All right. I'm excited to have Matt Bufton with us today. Matt is a co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Studies in Canada and has served as its executive director since 2010. Matt's a graduate of business at the University of Windsor. He went back to study political science, also at Windsor, and then he went on to study public policy at the University of Michigan. Matt's a graduate of the Atlas Network's MBA program in think tank management and in think tank leadership. He's a sought-after speaker and opinion leader, and it's a real pleasure to have you here, Matt.
Thanks, Sean. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. So this spring in Canada, we're looking at elections provincially and federally, and voters always have the opportunity to vote for the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, often several other parties. What do the words liberal and conservative mean in Canadian politics?
Canadian politics, I think that they mean very vague and indeterminate sort of things. I think of both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party as some sort of collection of interest groups. They're political science terms, brokerage parties that are trying to put together sort of coalitions of people. And historically, we expect the Liberals to be a little bit left of center. We expect the Conservatives to be a little bit right of center. But of course, those things move over time and shift and change. Both of these parties are more interested in winning elections than in any sort of actual ideological or public policy mission. Of course, the Liberal Party, about a year ago, they would have told us, I think, that a carbon tax was a sort of existential matter of the utmost importance. And now we have a leadership race where the two primary contestants for the leadership race are promising to scrap most of, if not all of, that carbon tax, because that's what voters want. So these are two political parties that we have labels on them. I think they actually may confuse a bit more than they help, because liberal has a lot of historical things, as in the way that I use the word liberal. Conservative is, I think, a very vague term. And they are trying to win elections. They're trying to put together packages of policies that will help them win those elections. And we know a little bit about where they stand by the use of the word liberal and conservative. But overall, these are vague and fuzzy terms.
Yeah, good answer. So how do you use the word liberal?
I use the word liberal, I will sometimes say, in the original and true sense of the word. I consider myself a liberal in the sense that I'm interested in a large degree of liberty for people. And I put that on both of the economic and the sort of political and civil rights sphere. And I think that is one sort of problem with modern politics generally, but also specifically in Canada or in Ontario, where you tend to have two parties or two coalitions that put emphasis on different areas. So one way of thinking of the left and right in Canadian or Ontario politics is that people will think that the right is concerned about economic freedom. There's some quibble on that a bit, but it's close enough to being true. And the left is a bit more concerned maybe about personal and civil freedom. Again, I have quibbles. Let's call it close enough to being true. But I'm someone who thinks that both of those matter a lot. And it's not about prioritizing tax cuts over personal freedoms. I think we should advocate for both of those things.
So which party then do you find is more pro-liberty at this point in time?
I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that. I expect many of your listeners would think that it is obviously the Conservative Party. And they may be right. There's a level at which Pierre Poilievre is talking a good game. He will sometimes say, I think he says, he certainly talked about as having some libertarian instincts and some libertarian tendencies. And I think there is some basis in that. And sometimes I hear him make comments that do appeal to me quite a lot. But also I hear things, the last thing I saw was he was talking about putting life sentences on people with, I think, 40 milligrams of fentanyl. To me, that's a very anti-liberty policy. And so he talks a good game, sometimes not as good a game, and other times there's a question of what he's going to do actually in office. And one of my strongly held opinions is that I am terrible. I think a lot of people are terrible, but I know I'm terrible at predicting what politicians will do in office. Poilievre has proposed a sort of suite of policies. Some are good, some are bad. There's a chance we'll get a mix. There's a chance we might lean towards the good or the bad. And so that is my sort of big concern in that area.
Yeah, so great answer. And I apologize if I put you in an awkward spot as a executive director of a policy think tank in Canada. You're officially nonpartisan, and here I am trying to trap you into compromising your status and your funding. I apologize for that. So you mentioned liberty. Where do you think we should go with respect to fentanyl or marijuana? Or I know liberty is a central topic of discussion when it comes to recreational drugs. So what are your thoughts on that?
So my position on this is that when an adult decides they want to put a chemical in their body, it is not up to the rest of us to interfere with that. Now, we might have opinions and judgment. Certainly, you're a medical doctor. You would have opinions on the things that people might do and how they might be good or bad for them. And this is sometimes, I think, a mistake that people think about libertarians, is that because I think all drugs should be legal, I think it's fine to do drugs. They're perfectly good for you. And that's not my opinion. Many drugs can be bad for you. Many lifestyle choices, many diet choices can be bad for you. And I'm perfectly happy for people like yourselves with expertise in that area to have an opinion and say, hey, I don't think you should be using fentanyl recreationally, right? This is a powerful drug. You should stay away from it. And I think that is probably a good and sound opinion. My problem is that when we then start to make this a matter of law and try to use the force of the state, and again, for you to say to someone, I don't think you should take fentanyl is one thing. For you to say, I've got men with guns outside, and if you continue to take fentanyl, they're going to come in here, they're going to take you in, again, under Poilievre's suggestion, they're going to put you in jail for life. I think that's completely wrong, and I think it's equally wrong as you might have a patient who's eating at McDonald's twice a day. He said, that's not a good idea. You should stop. And that's probably not a good idea. They should probably stop, right? But no one, I think, would support you saying, I've got men with guns in the hallway outside. And if you don't stop eating McDonald's twice a day, they're going to take you away and they're going to put you in jail.
Yeah, so powerful case, certainly, for individual choice. So you used the word libertarian. I used to consider myself a libertarian, and I still think I'm a libertarian when it comes to health policy and a lot of things. I feel there's way too many restrictions on it, but I've drifted away from that position. I'm wondering if you could help us understand what that word means. Again, in a Canadian context or textbook context, if you want to use the word, I'm just wondering if you could unpack it a bit.
Yeah, and it's in some ways a muddled and artificial word because it's a response by people who consider themselves liberals. And then in the first part of the 20th century, what it means to be a liberal starts to change more towards a modern context. And so this was causing confusion, and they tried to come up with another word. So they use libertarian. Libertarian actually starts with, I think, French anarchists in the 19th century. And they are quite different from, I think, modern libertarians. But the word now is most often used to describe someone who might be like a Milton Friedman, a Murray Rothbard sort of person. Ayn Rand is often talked about as a libertarian. She hated that word. She thought she had her own philosophy called objectivism, and that was what she wanted to be referred to as. But these are all people who think that individual rights are really strong. And now some libertarians are anarchists, but for textbook purposes, I think it's actually useful to draw a distinction and say we have anarchists who believe in no government, and every transaction should be voluntary, every interaction between people should be voluntary. And then we have our libertarians who think that we should have some role for government. So it's probably okay to have a little bit of taxation. We're going to have an army to protect us against foreign aggression. We're going to have a police and court and justice system to protect us against those of us within our society who want to commit violence against others. But that's pretty much it. And aside from that, almost everything is going to be done through voluntary transactions on the market.
Yeah, great answer. And again, I agree with so much of what you said. The thing that forced me to second guess my libertarian roots was I realized that perhaps I was having too high an opinion of everybody around me and thinking, just like you said, if we could even get rid of, if we had no government at all, in a peaceful sense, though, not anarchists who blow things up, but I'm thinking of Kropotkin, right? The Russian writer, or you mentioned the French writers, Proudhon, multiply your associations and be free, he said. I love that. That really resonates with me. The challenge for me, and even over the last 5, 6 years, has been that some people don't have any sense of internal restraint. They don't even want to have a conversation. They'll just start yelling at you if they disagree with you. So how do you manage that when society seems to have started to lose its guardrails, if we can use that term?
Well, I think there's several answers to that. One is to say that, yeah, I think there's a level on which libertarianism is a sort of optimistic faith in human beings sort of worldview. But I will say that also libertarianism is not like utopian. So to be a libertarian and to think that people should be free to make their decisions is to also recognize that sometimes people are going to make bad decisions. You might have that patient who's taking fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, whatever it is. You might have that patient who's eating McDonald's multiple times a day. And these are bad decisions, and almost everybody would look and go, yeah, those are bad decisions. We shouldn't make those decisions. But the question becomes, will we help them make better decisions with the threat of men with guns waiting out in the hallway, right? And libertarians always use this men with guns at the point of a gun sort of thing. Some people think it's overblown. I actually think it's useful to be cognizant that what we're talking about is compelling someone to do something against their will, right? Fortunately, I have very little personal experience with any kind of addiction. That hasn't been an issue in our family or anything like that. But one thing I hear a lot when people talk about things like issues of addiction is like the person has to be ready to change, right? That if you had a problem with a substance, for your family to bundle you up in a car and kidnap you overnight and take you to a treatment center probably is going to work. You need to get to that point in your life where you say, hey, look, I'm missing out on things. Things aren't going the way I want. I want to change. And then it's good to have people there who can help you make that change. And I think this applies to things going back to drug laws of the idea that like, hey, if you're not ready to change, saying we're going to throw you in jail for life. This is not going to improve your life. We've now got to pay for the expense of keeping you in jail and stopping you from doing the thing that you want to do. To be a libertarian doesn't mean you think people are going to make perfect choices. It just means that you either think you're not going to be able to compel them to act the way that you think that they should, or, and this also will be part of it, you recognize that there's rational people can disagree. We'll all probably agree you shouldn't eat McDonald's twice a day. But should you eat McDonald's once a week or once a month? Certainly, I'm sure people who would think, no, you should never eat at McDonald's. Many of us would say, yeah, it's reasonable to eat there once a month, once a week, whatever it is, to have a generally balanced diet. And so we need to recognize the limits, both morally and from a sort of utilitarian function, on our desire and ability to impose our views and our preferences on other people.
So you keep mentioning McDonald's and you're making me feel more and more guilty as you go. I'm hoping you're not going to start talking about Tim Hortons and double doubles and things like that. So I find it really hard to change my diet, even though I believe I'm a rational being with a free agency. It seems to me that people who are very sick from their addiction, whatever pharmaceutical they're addicted to, or even alcohol, that they lose their sense of agency and they become locked in there. I'm wondering what the libertarian response would be to those folks who have got to a point where they can't even decide to go to treatment because they're so locked into their addiction.
Other people are forcing you to do something, you've definitely lost your agency. So maybe one part of that answer is maybe we could consider that you could have in some way lost your agency compared to the alternative of we're taking away your agency. So I think that you bring up alcohol. I've been talking about these things like fentanyl and heroin, these things that we prohibit, and most people are not using recreationally. But a lot of people use alcohol recreationally. And at one point, about 100 years ago, in Canada, but especially in the US, we looked at this and said, this is a big problem. We're going to make it illegal because of the problems that alcohol causes. Very few people regard prohibition of alcohol as a success story. And to me, you look at this exactly the same way that you look at prohibition of other drugs, right? Yes, it causes problems. Yes, there are people who struggle with addiction. And yes, we really want to make sure that we have some ways of supporting people and helping people who struggle with that. But making it illegal and imposing the costs of having all of that enforcement is not the right way.
So is there, I guess I'm coming from the therapeutic end of things, is there a way that we could support forced treatment, essentially, treatment against your will, but within a libertarian framework? Is there space within a libertarian philosophy for taking action when someone is in a state where they've lost their agency? Not permanently, not putting them in jail, not treating them poorly, putting them in beautiful treatment centers, even just for a week, so that they can regain some of that agency. And if they choose to go back to what they're doing, so it be it. But at least you've tried. Does that fit anywhere within a libertarian political worldview, or is that something that just wouldn't fit either?
I don't think that can fit at all. As if you're talking about actual sort of libertarianism, then the idea that you are going to, just in this case, intervene for people's own good does not fit. Now, of course, we don't live in a libertarian world, and I don't think we'll ever live in a libertarian world. So this is an argument that people discuss. And many people who are generally, might say they have libertarian instincts or they appreciate individual freedom, would support this kind of thing. The best thing I can say about it is I would favor a system of forced treatment over putting someone in a jail cell. So we're going to pick up the person who's using illegal drugs, and it's a choice between taking them to jail, putting them into jail perhaps for months or years, or taking them to a treatment center. You said a week, I don't know how long it will be, but yeah, a week, a month, whatever it is, putting them in, and it's a nice rehab center, and we make them stay there, right? So I think that is a better, and if we're looking at like a libertarian gradient, then that would be a more libertarian solution than to putting them in jail. But I will come back to my comments about my understanding of addiction is the people who work in this say you have to be ready to change. So if we're taking them to a rehab center, do the people working at the rehab center believe that when we've picked up your friend who just can't stop using drugs and forced him to go to that center for a week or a month, does the rehab people think this is helping? Or are they going to be like, oh, no, we're just going to have him here, we're going to fight with him for a period of time, and then he's going to be back on the street and doing what he's want to do? And if the rehab people don't think it's effective, then I think we should question whether we think it will be effective to treat people that way.
Yeah, another great answer. What we do just before we leave the addictions topic is what we generally do is if someone is in so bad shape that they're lying on the street, they're getting pressure sores on their limbs because they've been passed out so long in the cold, or they're getting frostbite, we scoop them up, try to stabilize them, give them antibiotics if they need to, hopefully get them to a point where they're able to walk. And then if they want to walk out the door, they walk out the door. It is hard, though, to watch the same people get scooped off the street, especially in the wintertime, over and over. And you really start to wonder, this seems like a challenge to my freedom-loving instincts. But anyways, we'll leave that for a second. The other, unless you want to comment on that. Did you want to say
Only
something?
just to say that I think I'll stress what I said earlier. Libertarianism is not utopia. So it's not to say that if we allowed people to use drugs, then everybody would be fine, everything would be great. We would still have some of these very sad stories. But I do think we should look at the question of, are we improving things by doing this? Or is perhaps the best we can do, pick them up when they're unable to get it themselves, give them treatment, offer them, and we can offer them a place to go to get rehab if they're ready. I think that's great. But the compulsion, I don't think is going to work. I'll stop there and we can move on to the next topic.
Yeah, no, you're giving very prudential-based answers. So you're sounding a lot like Edmund Burke here with his emphasis on, I won't tease you that you're a closet hardcore conservative. I know that's not the case. So you also mentioned that we want to maximize freedom, and yet we don't want people to behave in such a way that they're a danger to others. You said we need some government for that. And earlier, you and I were talking about things like unorganized sports. So shinny hockey or pickup soccer or a friendly game of volleyball on Friday evening with no referees present. How do you allow a sense of what is okay within this game of shinny hockey. So shinny hockey, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, a bunch of guys get together. You say, we're going to play hockey. We have no referees. We're going to have no hitting. And that means nothing that would be called as a penalty as well, slashing or elbowing and that sort of thing. And then you hope the players will self-police themselves. However, inevitably, someone will get a bit chippy, they'll slash, or they'll raise an elbow, or they may even hit another guy. And then everybody on the ice has to come around and say, no, you're ruining the experience for the rest of us. And that experience, we could call it a common good. Everybody on the ice wants to have a great game and not get injured. They have jobs to go back to. How do libertarians, or how does libertarian thought unpack the concept of a common good, both with respect to shinny hockey or pickup game of soccer, but then on a broader scale in society at large?
So a lot of libertarians would lean on something spontaneous order. If anyone's watching this, they can see over my shoulder here a picture of a guy named Friedrich Hayek. He, along with other people like Ludwig von Mises and people before them, really formulated and refined this idea of spontaneous order or emergent order. I think emergent order is actually the better term, because spontaneous implies that it just happens, right? But that's not the way. You guys don't show up for your shinny game and just automatically good rules appear out of nowhere, right? But they do emerge, hopefully. And so what you do is you have some obvious rules, right? You're not going to have punching in the face, and hopefully that's not an issue, right? But disagreement and dispute can happen on the margins, right? Was that slash? Was it a poke check? How did that go? Was that a hip check a bit too rough? Some body contact is probably within the lines of your shinny game. And so what you guys need to do as a group is work your way through this. And every now and then you might have to stop and have discussions. Sometimes you might be talking after the game saying, oh, I think what Ted did was a little out of bounds. I thought what Joe did was fine. And in this way, these norms and rules for your game will emerge. So they will not be there the first time your group plays hockey. But after you guys have been playing for months or maybe even years, these rules will become clear. It'll become apparent to everybody in the game. They may never be written down. In fact, they probably will not be written down, right? But they'll be understood by the players in the game. New players can join the game, and it may take them a little while to get on board and to fully understand, but they can be caught up to speed and shown the way that you guys play, and that might be a little bit different than some other shinny game they played in, right? Some will be a little more aggressive, some will be less aggressive, and that's fine, right? There is no one set of rules that is correct set of rules. So if you were a more aggressive player, you might actually decide to leave the game that you plan and go, I've heard that guys play on Monday night or a little more gentle. And if you're a more competitive, hard-nosed guys, you go, these guys my Tuesday night game, right? They're all they don't want to be as aggressive. They're all very careful. They got jobs to get up to the next morning. They don't want to be hurt. But the Friday night game, we really get aggressive when we get in the corners. We have hard noses. That is all fine and good. That is part of this self-organization of groups. Part of that can be taking yourself out of a group whose norms you don't like and getting into a group whose norms fit better with what you want to play. This does not guarantee there will never be issues, right? You may still have someone in your game who is too aggressive. When you point it out to them, they argue, deny, say that you guys are the ones who are wrong. That's all okay. This is part of the process of figuring out these norms, of doing this. You may sometimes get to a point where you have to tell someone they're no longer welcome to join you, right? If they just won't play by the rules that everybody else wants to play by, you say, hey, we don't want you here next week. Go find that other game to join. And maybe if this happens to them enough times, they'll realize there's not a game that they can't join, and they will be compelled to change their behavior, even if they don't think it's right. And so we have this set of emergent rules that can work. We're using the shinny hockey analogy, but this could go to many areas of society. And again, one thing I'll point to is that sort of real world example of, even if you're a little unhappy with the way your shinny game is being played, do you think it would be better if the government had a shinny hockey agency, and in order to play a game of shinny hockey, you had to call up your local city hall and say, we'd like to have a game at this location, this day, this time. Could you please send a referee who will come in and make sure that we abide by the set of rules that is written down in City Hall. And maybe some people would like that, but in general, I think we understand that self-organization and emergent order work in the hockey sphere, and I wish more people would apply that to more realms of life.
Yeah, brilliant answer. And spoken by someone who clearly has played shinny hockey a bit here and there.
Not since I was about 11 years old, I think.
No way. Wow. So you must play pickup soccer or something else because you caught that perfectly. Yeah.
I'm glad it
Do you
worked.
play-
The sport I really focus on is curling, which also is actually there's no referees in curling. There are sometimes small disputes, and we have to figure it out amongst ourselves. And there's a strong tradition of having a beer with the other team after the game.
So you captured perfectly the idea of how a sense of what's considered fair play will emerge within a particular group of shinny hockey players. And Monday night will feel very different than the Friday night group. You've done that beautifully. As you were saying that, I was thinking, when there's really a dispute, what will often happen is a player will say, yeah, but in the NHL rules, you're allowed to skate backwards into the zone as long as the puck is on your stick. So there's an appeal to some authority, some rule, some body of legislation of laws that most of the players on the ice would agree with. Is it possible that libertarian and a libertarian approach to shinny or to society will only work, or does it require a system where people already have a sense of the NHL rule book? And so you bring to the game some sense of fair play. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say in the sense that in this analogy, the NHL rulebook is like all the background of society, right? So there's a sense in which the NHL rules are also the product of emergent order. Now, it's true that there's like a top-down level, certainly now, right? Where if the NHL wants to make a change, I assume it's happening in the league office in New York, and they bring in the top referees and the top league executives, some players' representatives or whatever it is, and then it comes down. But I imagine that when the NHL wrote its first rule book, it was largely transcribing what was already in place, right? They didn't start from a blank sheet. So okay, I'm going to invent a thing called a puck and a hockey stick, and we're going to make this game, right? They were writing down what was in place. And since then, there's been a series of changes and amendments. And there's still a degree to which this is, even though it may be planned top-down from league offices, a sense to which it is that emergent order because it is not compelled, right? Nobody has to play NHL hockey. And so although it's unlikely, it's at least conceivable the league could pass a set of laws that all the players thought were so ridiculous. The players said, that's it, we're done. We're going to go join some other league, the IHL, the AHL, whatever it is, and go that way. A new league starts up. The important thing about the NHL rulebook is there's no government force compelling anyone to play by that, right? The rules are, if you want to play in the NHL, you play by these rules, and most people accept that. Sometimes people are punished or suspended. I suspect there are cases, although I can't think of it at the top of my head, where people are just being expelled from the NHL for violating some of those rules. But on a grand scale, it's not that different from the person who's told they can't come to your shinny game, right? It's a voluntary association of people who choose to be together, and no one is compelled to be there. And if you're asked to leave, it's being asked not to attend a sort of voluntary element within society.
Yeah, and the idea of compulsion and emergence of accepted norms and behaviors, I totally agree with that for sure. Could we call that emergent set of norms a common good?
I'm not sure that we would call it, or I would call it a common good, but I think that there's a level at which it advances the common good to have those shared norms. My problem is that with calling it the common good is that I'm not sure I believe in a singular the common good, right? I think there are common goods. We'll keep on with the sporting analogy, right? There is a common good among your shinny game for the people who choose to take part. But there's people like me who don't want to play hockey. I'm a terrible skater. No, I'd rather go curling. I play squash once in a while. In the summer, I sometimes golf badly, and I just never play hockey. For me, the common good doesn't really actually relate to rules around shinny, because I have these other things that I do that also have their own rules, and the sort of the boundaries of the common good, as it were, extend to the people who choose to participate, but then do not extend to cover anyone who doesn't want to be covered. And to me, this is many of the rules that we might have in society should be voluntary. Getting a little bit more into public policy and away from sports, take something like health inspections, right? We in most cities and countries in rich nations have people from the government who will go around to restaurants and inspect the way they handle food. And if they don't like the way that the food is being handled, if the violations are bad enough, they will shut down the restaurant. Say, Sean, you cannot go to that restaurant and you cannot eat there. And sometimes they're putting like poison in the food or all sorts of bacteria. Maybe you wouldn't want to be there. But there's other things like cooking hamburgers that are medium rare. I don't know, but you actually like to have a hamburger medium rare. In Ontario, the health code essentially prohibits it. They scare everyone away so much that very few restaurants will do it. And that's the kind of thing that I oppose. I would be fine with a private agency, but if we have to compromise, it could be a government agency that went around and cataloged lists of practices of, say, food handling and perhaps foodborne illness, and made this information available to us to help us make better choices in deciding where we're going to eat and what we're going to do, or something like that. But it is the element of force of compulsion of saying, hey, we've decided that medium rare hamburgers are outside of the risk tolerance for anybody, and that you therefore must not have them. And that's what I really object to.
Yeah. And that applies to unpasteurized milk and unpasteurized cheese and on. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, huge. Yeah, huge issue. So again, as I'm listening to you, you're making great sense, and you offer the option of exit. So if you don't like this shinny game, you don't have to go. Or if you really don't like the way it's being played and you refuse to play it the way it's being played, you can be compelled to leave. That presupposes somewhere in which to leave to. And so there's actually this space outside of the shinny hockey game. There's this space outside of the restaurants that aren't health approved or that don't pass health inspection. And so when we're thinking now of the nation of Canada, are there a set of expectations, norms, behaviors that emerge from all of us living together in this chunk of land called Canada? Or is Canada more just a neutral space with a whole bunch of little pockets of shinny and restaurants and curling bonspiels that you can join or not? And when you don't join, you're in this neutral area where you can do whatever you want. So can you help unpack that? How do we live together in a nation when some people say, I don't accept your norms and behaviors. I want to do different norms and behaviors?
Yeah. And this is really getting into that sort of historical consideration of liberalism, right? And so for much of human society, when people were living in groups a long time ago, we did not allow the space for differences, right? Religion is a really good example, right? So for most of human history, people of different religions didn't live together. And so if we had a fundamental disagreement about what the best way to honor our ancestors or to ensure a bountiful harvest next year or something like that, then we were either going to have to exile, the people who disagreed, or maybe kill each other over it, or beat each other into submission, right? And then relatively recently, within the past few centuries, it started to become more common that we actually lived in societies that allowed that difference, right? So on the religious aspects, you can be in Canada, and I think very few people would make the argument that there's any specific religious belief you have to be a good Canadian, right? And we won't necessarily try and define exactly what a good Canadian is, but I think most of your listeners would agree that you can be a good Canadian and be a Jew. You can be a good Canadian and be a Catholic or Anglican or a Muslim, and there's space within that to be a good Canadian and to believe those things. Now, the only way that can work is if we acknowledge that other people have that too, right? So you can practice your religious beliefs, I can practice my religious beliefs, or in my case, my lack of religious beliefs. And I'm free to do that. And I might try to convince you. I might set up a table and explain to you why I think you should be more agnostic than you are, perhaps, or try to convert you to whatever religion I might like. That is totally fine and on the table. What I don't get to do is compel you to believe what I believe. And I can't be overly aggressive in demanding that we all believe the same thing. Because part of living in the country of Canada as we know it is acknowledging these religious differences. And hopefully we are accepting of those other religious groups, but we don't have to be accepting. We can think those ideas are bad. We might even think they are dangerous in some sense, but we have to tolerate them. And that is a fundamental agreement of our social contract's a loaded word, but I'll throw it. We have a bit of a social contract and also a legal contract in some sense, that demands that religious tolerance of other people. And so we might think these ideas are bad and silly. We might make fun of them. That's okay. But we have to allow people to live in that other world and have those beliefs. And to expand that more broadly, a liberal society is one that allows many conceptions of the common good. Perhaps ultimately we almost have 40 million conceptions of the common good in Canada. People who share the same religion might then have differences about which sport they want to play, which TV shows they want to watch. And we should allow as much space as possible for all those many ideas of the good life. We have to draw a line somewhere. In this case, we're drawing the line against aggressing against other people, right? If your idea of the good life is to go and punch strangers on a Friday night, we say, no, that doesn't work. You have to stop there because you're interfering with other people's ability to live their good life. But so far as your conception of the common life is an internal thing to you, and it may be a thing also you celebrate with people who choose to associate with you, that is all fine, that is all good. And I think that's how it should be. There are certainly historical examples of limits placed on what people can do, and even within Canada, which is a relatively free country, there's some limits that I would disagree with on what it is that people can do because we're trying to put limits on boundaries around that. I think a libertarian state, a properly liberal state, is one that allows a really wide degree of what it is you can do, with the comment that you cannot commit aggression, violence, theft against other people.
So you mentioned toleration. Has Canada become less tolerant over the last few years?
That's a good question. I thought you were going to say more. Has Canada become less tolerant over the last decades or since our founding or something? In which case, I think the answer is certainly almost that it's become more tolerant. Over the last few years, that's a tricky question. I certainly think there are areas in which we've become less tolerant. And the one that comes immediately to mind is around things like vaccines and some of our responses to COVID. Now, I'm a big fan of modern medicine and vaccines, and so I think they're good for me. And if someone wanted me to argue that they were good for them, I don't have a medical background, I can make something of an argument that they were good for them. But if someone wasn't convinced by my admittedly very amateurish arguments over why they should like vaccines or get vaccines, I'm not going to be offended. And I don't think that I have any right to try and compel them or force them to take them. Now, it will be totally within my libertarian worldview to say, I'm not going to associate with you if you're not vaccinated. And so I can imagine certain situations in which I would do that. But generally speaking, a lot of times we're talking about the COVID vaccine, right? If someone is not COVID vaccinated, especially now when almost everybody has vaccines, almost everybody has gotten COVID and has that level of natural immunity, I'm just not that worried about it. And so I think that it should not be as big a deal, but I think it becomes a very tribal thing. And actually, I was at an event a few weeks ago and someone came up to me, a big smile on his face, and he said, I heard you're unvaccinated like me. And I was like, actually, that's not true. But also, a little weird to me, that would be like a point of bonding. This would be such an important part of our social identity that it becomes this shared point of thing. And I think that does present a level of less tolerance, that we're becoming more intolerant of people, at least in that area, who don't share our views. And perhaps there are other areas too. Over a short time period and so many different factors, I think it's really hard to speak with confidence either way.
Yeah. I guess what I had in the back of my mind were some of the public expressions of old world disagreements showing up on Canadian soil. And I think to myself, that's very weird. I've never seen that in the last many years in Canada, and yet it seems to be showing up more and more. I won't put you on the spot to answer that, but that's what was in my mind.
I'll throw in a quick answer, which is just to say that with all of these things, we have a problem of the people who have loud opinions are the most visible, right? And so if there is a protest somewhere, I'm talking, I think the war in Israel and Gaza, and there's a protest and 200 people come out and they shout, "Death to Jews, the death to Israel." That's an important view in my opinion. It's also one's I would protect it by free speech, that if you're not actually going to follow up the violence, you have a right to say it. And that should be our approach to that. But also that's going to get a lot of attention, right? That will probably be covered widely if, say, it happens on Parliament Hill. Let's say it's 200 people. We live in a country of 40 million people. And so to try and project this out and figure out, what, if anything, does this actually tell us about our country when we see these, protests covered? Very hard to say.
Great answer again. You've given these answers before, so listeners need to know that Matt Bufton sets up conferences for students. He's used to being asked hard questions and giving great answers, and so this is not his first rodeo. Now, you mentioned Canada, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau famously said to the New York Times in 2015 that Canada is joined by sharing a set of values, and we are the first post-national state. So what do you think Canada is? Are we a post-national state? Are we a nation? What would be the libertarian understanding of a nation?
Good question. And I'm not sure if there's a particularly libertarian understanding of a nation. Drawing a little bit on some of my understanding of political science, I would say that nation tends to refer to a sort of group of people with some sort of historical, ethnic sort of ties, right? So there's a sense in which there's a French nation and a German nation, an Italian nation. In that sense, I'm not sure that it really makes sense to think of like a Canadian nation, right? You have so many Canadians, and I forget the exact number, but I think it's more than 20% of Canadian citizens or residents now were born outside of the country. And of course, they come from a whole variety of different places. If you include people who then have been here one generation, my parents were born somewhere else and came here. So you have this really multi-ethnic, multifaceted background of all these people. So in that sense, I don't think that there's a Canadian nation, and I think that's okay. I don't think we would be better off if we had sealed the doors in, 1925 or something like that and said, we're only going to allow in 1% of the people that we actually would allow in, or whatever it is, some small number of people, so that we keep this so we can develop that Canadian national identity. And in centuries to come, there will be like a distinct Canadian nation. I don't think much is gained by that. So mostly I think of Canada as a state, right? In the, again, political science term of which it is a government and we have government authority. But I think many people think of it, nations and states are often used in a conflated sort of way. So is there a Canadian nation? I don't know. There's a sense of identity. It's ever evolving and ever changing. I think that is generally a sort of good thing. Of course, we're recording this in the context of Donald Trump's tariff threats, and Canadian nationalism is definitely on the rise in the past month.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, as you were talking, I was trying to remember how Michael Oakeshott separated these. I think he was one of the first to identify that term nation state as a contradiction in terms. But maybe to put it bluntly, so are you in support of Trudeau's "we are a post-nation state"?
I'm not even sure that I know how to interpret it. So I haven't read the actual Oakeshott thing you're referring to. My first top-level take is I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction in terms, because there are things that are nation states, right? Japan seems like an obvious example where they are both a nation and a state, right? And then you would have places that were a little more gray, and then again to get to Canada, and I think we are much more a state than a nation. Probably the closest thing to a nation is the Quebecois nation that was famously a nation within a state. So I don't even, are we a post-nation state? That sort of seems to imply that like we were a nation state and now we've moved past that in some way. And I'm not sure that's the way of describing it. I think we are a state that doesn't really lean on our national identity in the way that so many other places do. And I feel like many people think maybe that is a shame, that we should have a stronger national identity. And I think that's a natural, biological, hardwired sense of belongingness, that I understand why people think it. However, I'm not sure that it would actually benefit us to have this like stronger sense of nationhood. And when I say I want to play squash, people go, no, you must be curling or playing hockey. These are the Canadian things that we do in our nation, and you cannot do any other sports.
Yeah, great answer. Again, one of the last questions I'll ask, I'm going to ask two more questions. So the penultimate one, you mentioned social contract. And so I just wanted to understand what you mean by that. And I'll just let you, what do you mean by social contract?
Right. So the social contract is the idea that we have some sort of implicit agreement. It's not an explicit one that we've actually signed on to, but we've agreed to do certain things within our society. I think it was most often invoked with the idea that you either must do something or must accept something that you don't want to accept, because there is this sort of idea of an explicit social contract or an implicit social contract. So certainly my position on something like universal health care is I think that this should actually be run on the market. If we want to provide money for people who can't afford health care, that's something to do. But to actually have the government run and administer the system, I think this is how we get a system that fares so poorly and so many Canadians don't have family doctors. I think a number of people would rebut me and say, no, like Canadian Medicare is part of our social contract, that we have all implicitly agreed by virtue of our being born in Canada, and therefore I would be wrong to advocate against this thing. To end Medicare would be a violation of a social contract. So I certainly don't think we have that sort of social contract. But I do think there's a level in which we agree on things in society, and there are certain things that are put into law, but there are other things that you should do. Like there's no law, I don't think, that says you can't shovel all of your snow onto your neighbor's driveway. We just had a huge amount of snow here this week. That's not a law. If you were to do that, you would be behaving badly, and maybe a social contract is one way of understanding we have this implicit agreement that you don't improve your property by making your neighbor's property worse. But it is this sort of implicit thing. I think I'm right in saying there's no law saying you can't do that. I don't think there should be a law to do that.
I was going to say only one more question, but you made me wonder, are there involuntary obligations that libertarians recognize? For example, you're born into a family, you don't get to choose your parents, and so now you're stuck with the parents and the siblings that you have. How do libertarians unpack or conceptualize involuntary obligations?
So I think a really important point here that we may haven't touched on is that libertarianism is a political philosophy, right? So libertarianism tells you about the relationship between you and the state. I'm a libertarian, but that part of my philosophy does not tell you really anything about my views, about my obligations to some sort of group or family, my religious beliefs, anything like that. So you can be a libertarian who's a Catholic, you can be a libertarian who's an atheist, you can be a libertarian who's Muslim. The important thing is that you don't want to compel anyone to follow those beliefs. And similarly, my libertarianism tells you nothing about my views on family obligations. My personal view is something along the lines of, yeah, you have some obligation to the family. However, the family could treat you badly enough that you would be completely justified in just saying, that's it. I don't want to see any of you ever again. I'm moving to Thailand and I'm not giving you my contact information. I will never see any of you people again. I have a perfectly great family. I'm not going to do that. However, that would be a view. I know libertarians who would think that you have very strong family obligations, right? Doesn't matter what you do, what your family does. Doesn't matter how badly your parents treat you. They're your family. Family comes first. You have this obligation to honor and respect them. That would not be in any way a contradiction with a sort of libertarian conception. So you have to have some sort of other view that is not part and parcel of the libertarian worldview that will inform your thinking about those sort of involuntary associations.
So now I wish I had asked you that question an hour ago.
I can come back sometime if you want.
This is fantastic. So my last question was just simply, what do you wish I had asked you that I didn't ask? So what big issue What's the elephant in the room that we're missing in our politics in Canada?
So in terms of what you asked me that, or I wish you'd asked me that you didn't ask me, maybe I'll nudge you into asking me one last question, because I'm curious. You've mentioned a couple things that you disagree with in sort of libertarian ideas, or at least you have concerns or reservations about. We talked through a few of them, but I feel like there are others. So I'm curious, is there something else that you look at a libertarian like me and you think, Matt is just wrong about how we would actually solve this? And if I had a convincing answer to that, maybe I could be a libertarian again.
Yeah, so beautiful jujitsu on flipping the question back on me. Nice try, Matt. No, like I said, my journey from libertarianism to I think I'm in a philosophical conservatism has to do with two things. Number one, I think I was assuming that people had a better sense of you just shouldn't do that. Why are you not telling the truth? Because I can. No, that's not a good enough reason. Didn't your mother tell you anything? We could call it the parental absence problem. Perhaps we could call it that. The other thing that's made me drift towards a philosophical conservatism, and this would be a whole nother podcast, has to do with the presuppositions behind the different political philosophies. We could take someone like, you're an agnostic, so we'll take someone like David Hume, who I think you probably would find a lot of agreement with. He very much against the church, organized religion. And he also was very strong on his skepticism and saying, we can't trust people to think because people often don't think clearly. And so he is identified by many people as perhaps the first conservative philosopher. I don't agree with that, but they would argue that because he said the only thing we can really deal with is habit and custom. Humans aren't reasonable people, and we can't trust reason. It'll often lead us astray. And so we have to look to habit and custom that has emerged, to use your word, over centuries. And that's what we have to look to as a common good that we will compel other people to abide by. So for those two reasons, the lack of parental shaping, tell the truth, live up to your convictions, be courageous, do hard things, all these things like Jordan Peterson tells young men to do, clean your room. It seems like we have an absence of that. But then there are a number of philosophical empty spaces that I see on the libertarian side of the ledger that I wish were being filled out. And I've mentioned epistemology as one example. We could talk about ontology, anthropology, a whole bunch of other ologies that have made me say, oh, I think I need something more. But again, you're trying to turn this into another hour of podcast, Matt. So
well, this actually is really helpful in me deciding what I want to say with my last sort of thing, and I will try not to go on for another hour. But so in terms of the wishing people behave differently, yeah, people do all sorts. People recline their seats on airplanes, on short haul domestic flights, and there is absolutely no law presenting this, and apparently no one told them don't do that. So I absolutely am also often disappointed in the way that people act. I wish they'd been raised differently. And so the question there is, do we actually view the government as it actually is, not as we maybe wish it was? Do we think things could be made better? You mentioned people not telling the truth, right? And yeah, we could decide that, hey, we're actually going to use the power of government to make it so that people tell the truth. Now, how do we do that? I guess we start off with creating a ministry of truth, and the government right now, Trudeau would appoint a minister of truth. Some would say we're actually pretty close to that stage. Things you want to say, we could go one of two ways. You could either just have to submit anything you want to say to the Ministry of Truth to be verified, or we could go the other way and just report violations of untruthful things. And we have a hotline, and I could call up and say, I heard my friend Sean saying some untruthful things. I've transcribed what he said. Please go to his house and tell him he cannot say these things. And I think when I phrase it that way, almost everyone says, yeah, we don't want that, right? So yes, it's frustrating to live in a world where people say things that aren't true. And how can you not know that you shouldn't say that, right? But our only alternative is to have this sort of government ministry of truth. I don't think any of us want that. So we have to step away from that. And then the second part was wanting more philosophy, more deeper things. And I think that is also an important point, that sometimes people might look to libertarianism and want it to be more than a political philosophy, right? So you talked about wanting some sort of philosophical conservatism, some lifestyle tips about cleaning your room and things like that, that people that you think are important. There's nothing about thinking that's important that contradicts also being a libertarian, right? Unless you want to embody it in government, right? And I'm going to take a guess and think you probably don't want a clean your room law where representatives from the government Department of Cleanliness knock on your door at any time. They come and they say, we want to see your room. We want to make sure that it's being cleaned, right? So the things that you value, they could be religious things, philosophical things, aesthetic things, just theories about the universe and why things are the way they are. So far as they do not relate to the involvement between the government and the individual, they are not going to be in conflict with libertarianism. So you can be a libertarian hyphen, and we can put as many hyphens as you might want to after that. And I think that is a thing that many people come to confused about by libertarianism. And if we can make them understand that, then probably I could sell more people on the idea that they should be libertarians.
Matt, listeners need to go and check out your website. Check out the Institute for Liberal Studies, Executive Director Matt Bufton. Great answer. Libertarianism is a political philosophy primarily, and it really doesn't have, but wants you to have as much freedom as possible in the rest of your life. If you've enjoyed this show, please click subscribe, if I can even say the word correctly. Subscribe's on the bottom corner of the screen. It does two things. Number one, it lets you know when we have new content coming up, but it also helps the show. Subscribers are the only way that this podcast can survive. So once again, Matt, I really appreciate you being here, and we'll have to have you back, and we'll talk about drugs and social contract much more.
Sounds good. It was fun, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.